May 8th briefing agenda. And the first up on the agenda is the General Manager's comments. So, Mr. General Manager, turn over to you.
Mr. Board President, members of the board, good morning to everyone.
Good morning.
I first wanted to thank some board members for work above and beyond the call. First of all, Dr. Bethel for attending and actually hosting the North Portland budget workshop that we did yesterday. It's not heavily attended, but there were some very involved people for that. And board member Stovall for actually putting up with me more than he probably would like for 3 events over the last month, including a visit to a transit center. We had a transportation forum a week ago Saturday in East Portland that was hosted by a large panel of legislators. And then actually yesterday or thereabouts, we actually, the famous group entitled EMUCTUC, County Tornado Committee. So thank you for your time. And board member Saragosa was in attendance at our initial meeting of our Transit Equity Advisory Group as the board liaison. Thank you all for your activities over the last few weeks. I did want to just give you an update on the service disruption that we had on Monday. Again, our apologies to all the riders that were affected. It was a very vexing problem that we could not find in as quickly as we would like to have, but nonetheless we did find it. Service was restored by about 7 p.m. The cause, as it turned out, was a surge arrestor. It was essentially a mega version of the surge protector you plug your computer into. It is now in a laboratory being examined to find out what went wrong with it so that we can begin to see if any other proactive activities are needed system-wide to make sure that those kinds of outages don't occur again. As you can imagine, the web of wiring and safety devices and everything associated with it is extremely complex. We have a really expert team that really went above and beyond the all. They literally were inspecting, once we had isolated the quarter-mile section of track in one direction that was causing the problem, we were able to turn everything else on, turn that off, and we literally inspected inch by inch for the actually twice before we actually found the culprit. So great work there. I'd also note that there was great work on the part of Shelley's team and staff in terms of organizing the bus bridges and providing customer service. It's amazing to me that while we're feeling terrible and wanting to apologize for it, a lot of the customers are very appreciative of the extra help that they get. And we actually get a number of accommodations associated with that. So it was an unfortunate event, hopefully one that we can avoid repeating. I might note even later in that evening, just to note that Murphy continues to live occasionally and more than he should. We had an outage in Washington County where a train actually had a defective part, created an arc on the train, which blew the, if you will, the circuit breakers on the transformers on either side. So we had an outage there for a while. That was fixed within about an hour. But nonetheless, we had to get the train out of there and then turn the system back on and ready to go again. So our apologies again to our customers for all of that inconvenience. Again, and my thanks to Shelley and her team for the great work that they did in terms of actually getting service restored and providing those bus bridges. I might note that once we got the problem isolated to the steel bridge, we're pretty organized about a steel bridge bus bridge because we know how to do that. And done that. So, unfortunately, it's true. With a relatively few number of buses, we actually can get a lot of people through and connected. So, again, good work on the part.
Is that the same kind of surge protector we have throughout the system?
Yes, they are very frequent throughout the system, and it's not just the electrical system surges; it's also there's electric in the air and lots of other things that sort of that they protect from. And in any system like that that's also open and available to the public, it's the safety devices that usually are the complication, and that's a good thing because they're important to have in place. That is what makes a system complex. We had a full core of crew in addition to our full-time UCS over to Catenary crew. We also brought in our capital project staff that are working on the Portland, Milwaukee, so we have a lot of expertise on it. And, so we were doing everything we could. Again, apologies to the public for the inconvenience. Any other questions on that?
I've got just a couple in regards to kind of, the whole, the concept of kind of the state of good repair. When we think about, I would assume that, or I shouldn't say I assume, and I wonder how many systems are similar to ours across the U.S. and transit systems. I know there are other light rail systems, but it seems like many of them would be different. But as you think through that, I think, my major question centers around the idea of how, if we were to kind of put a percentage on it, what type of percentage would we place on the idea of how much of our system we are actively into preventive maintenance? I know it's a tough question, it's just formulating, but ultimately, as we look at, we know our buses, we know how many buses that we're replacing. That's kind of the preventive maintenance there, is that we keep our bus fleet under a certain number each year, say 13 years. How is that gauged in the MAX system? How do we keep track of that?
Well, it's actually a question, and actually probably is worthy of a briefing all on its own. We do what we call, first of all, each component has its own inspection and replacement cycles. So we begin to define when the system needs to be inspected, and for Catenary, probably about once a week it actually gets inspected. But then certain components get replaced on a timely basis. You might recall the contract not long ago for the switches that are in the substations, and that's aligned with that. For those major expenses, we keep track of those through our capital improvement program, which actually has a very detailed breakdown of the assets and what they're aging over time in terms of the replacement cycles. So we follow that pretty closely. I would, though, the reason that I think it's really more detailed is I think what is implied in your question is an assessment of risk on various elements, because I think that's the other question. You can replace something a little bit early and reduce risk greatly, or a little bit later and increase risk. And those are the considerations I think that we go through in trying to set those replacement, inspection, rehabilitation cycles. And maybe focusing on that a little bit, as well as the overall program would be a hopeful thing to go through for the board. One thing that I would note is that our light rail system, and this was part of the original light rail system, is the second oldest in the 48 U.S. states. So San Diego was the only system that was built before ours. And San Diego, incidentally, on their original line, is now going through a full replacement and rehab of the system. So it begins to tell you that it does call for investment. We'll talk about the budget, but one of the, I think, good things about this budget is we begin to really step into that in a strong way. Long way.
Well, no, you specifically touched on, what I was trying to get to, and I think a little more expanded explanation is probably due from the future, but it's allowing us to have a good idea of kind of where are we at on that replacement schedule. Yeah. Airplanes have to be annual every year, and you can get a little bit beyond that year mark, but you need to be taking a look at it. Yeah. So the question then goes to, like you said, you can go a little bit beyond that, and you increase your risk. You go further beyond that, you increase your risk exponentially. Right. And as we learned when we were out at the transit center, reliability is really, it almost came up that reliability was more important than service to, some harder to reach areas. Reliability was the key for people who use the transit system regularly, and kind of knowing where we are on that scale in regards to our replacement, it would be helpful, as we make budget decisions, both capital and operational.
The interesting thing is, I guess related to this, is where I would have been more worried is the vehicle, all the complexities of the vehicles. I wouldn't have put high risk the Catenary, but maybe, we need to sort of up the level, or lower the level of risk associated with our replacement inspection of that. Which is something that I know we'll be looking at. So.
Well, a vehicle goes down, you lose a vehicle. A Catenary goes down, we lose the system.
Yeah, in the sense of a track system, though, a vehicle can become a plug.
Right.
So that's the.
Oh, yeah.
That's the challenge. Yeah. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
question. Quick update, and finally, on Portland, Milwaukee. The bridge is, as you know, now starting to go horizontal instead of vertical. And actually, the vertical piece, though, is catching up to the permanent cables, and so that's actually going on this week for the first segment. So a lot of firsts this spring associated with what will become very repetitive activities as the bridge is completed. We're installing track now on this harbor structure, which you can see out the window here, so that is advancing quickly. On the 17th, the weekend of the 17th of May, we'll actually be placing the bridge girders across Powell Boulevard, so that will be a closure of Powell. That will be well advertised, and we've done this before when we did the demolition. This will be the last closure of Powell that won't be necessary, however, so we'll get the bridge girders in place and move on from there. And I would just note there are a number of other traffic impacts that will occur over this summer in particular. And it's just that phase of the construction where we can't completely avoid that. But we're working very closely with all the road agencies to coordinate those plans and make sure that detours and information are out to the traveling public associated with those. So, Mr. President, I think my remarks, unless there's any questions.
I was curious if the I-beam that was destroyed as a result of falling off the truck, 5 has been replaced.
My understanding is not quite been replaced yet. It was going to be a 30-day cycle. Fortunately, once it was not on the critical path,
Okay,
so
good. All right.
that's the good news.
This is the next one.
It will be here shortly, with it as the last phase of those deliveries. It will be a different route than the first.
Thank you. All right. Moving on, is it you and David doing a tag team here on the budget review?
That's right. And I'll just do the very quick introduction, but very quickly turn it over to Dave. We've had now the chance to review the budget with you, with the TSCC, with members of the public, and so we've been able to incorporate a number of sort of final revisions and fine tuning, and wanted to review those with you today. We also wanted to review with you what I would call our work program for the year ahead related to budget-related items and how we intend to advance with those, and get your feedback on that. And again, this is in preparation for proposing adoption of the budget at your May 22nd business meeting. So this is, I think, an important review to make sure that we have your comments well regarded and included. So maybe with that, I would turn to Dave to review the changes that we're proposing as we come into the language.
And I was going to speak from the draft of the memo that you'll be receiving. And we did review elements of this with the Finance Committee earlier today, and they've given us some good feedback that's not reflected yet in this version. But I'll really skip over the first 3 elements. The background obviously just lays out the processes we've gone through. But focusing on the second page on budget priorities first, obviously the key financial element for us moving forward is always going to be medical costs, both for active and retirees. At this point, the budget assumes ultimately that management is successful in its upcoming negotiations or arbitrations. The pension funding was, there's been a large increase in pension funding. The 2 pension plans, as you know, are not well funded at this point. The union plan is at 52%, the management plan is at 68%. The budget increases the funding that would go towards reducing the unfunded pension liability. We're moving from $30 million a year to $37 million a year. So at that rate, if we were to hit all our actuarial assumptions, it would bring us to full funding in about 17 to 18 years. a lot can change, so that, but under current assumptions, that's where we would hit full funding. On service reliability, again, there's no fare increase or service cuts proposed in this year's budget. And getting to what Board Member Stovall was talking about, there has been a large increase in the commitment to what we're calling state of good repair, or the federal government calls state of good repair. The budget assumes about $19 million of funding in this area, just on the capital side, and only $5 million of that is coming from new federal grants. So a large commitment of TriMet general fund dollars to this program as well. And what's not picked up here is the TriMet labor that goes into that. This is just the external capital costs. We've added over the last 2 years 20 LRV mechanics with an approximate cost of about $2 million to focus on bringing the vehicle maintenance up to the levels that we would expect. Service fixes. This budget now includes $2.1 million of additional money for bus service, and it implements portions of the West Side Service Enhancement Plan. So this is one of the changes from the earlier version. We've added another $500,000 to funding for additional service in Washington County. Wanted to just quickly hit the key budget assumptions. This is section 5 of that memo. The three sources of operating revenues: employer payroll tax, passenger revenue, and federal grants. The employer payroll tax, our lifeblood, we are lowering our assumed growth rate based on an updated forecast, and provided for you is a graph that, and on the back is the change. I guess I'll start on the back with the table. These are the top row is what the previous versions of the budget had assumed for payroll tax growth. It assumed 8.7%. Based on this updated forecast, we're reducing that to 6.8. And the key element is we're reducing the economists we work with has reduced their assumption for CPI or inflation for next year from 3.8% to 2.4%, and also somewhat reduced employment growth in the region. So if you factor out the rate increase, that leaves at what we call an underlying growth rate of 5.2%, which happens to be our long-term historic average growth rate. So just flipping back to the table maybe quickly, what we're showing here is the blue is the historic actual, and then red is what we're forecasting for this last quarter that we're in right now, and then this is the revised FY14 budget. We've added a trend line to this graph, and I think it demonstrates that the FY14 budget assumption is achievable. It's still somewhat aggressive, but is much more in line, I think, with what we would be likely to hit. So feel much better about that. Just hitting the other revenue assumptions briefly.
Before we
Sure.
do that, in the Finance Committee, we talked about the projection for the fourth quarter of this year. If you could talk about how much of that we've actually received to date, to basically explain why you think we're still going to get that large bump.
Good. Yes, as you can see, it's still the fourth quarter of this fiscal year is a pretty high growth assumption. At this point, the payroll tax is due 30 days after the end of the calendar quarter. So we have received now most of the revenue. It always trickles in, but we've received the bulk of the revenue. At this point, we have received over 90% of the amount of revenue that's projected here for this quarter. And based on then the historic trickle that comes in the last month and the end of the second month where we are right now, we feel comfortable that we'll be able to hit this growth rate. Does that answer the question?
And Director Prosser, I know you brought this up. This is one of the issues you were really concerned about. You're feeling better about this projection?
I'm feeling much better
Okay.
about this payroll tax forecast. I'm much more comfortable in this 6.8 underlying 5.2.
Okay, good. Thank you.
I'll run through in a minute the impact of this and how we're dealing with that impact. But just hitting the other two major revenue sources, again, we're assuming for passenger revenue, no fare increase, but a 3.3% increase in ridership that would generate an overall increase in revenue of about 5.6%. That difference is due to the fact that the fare increase was effective September 1 last year, so it only impacted 10 months this current year, and we'll get some percentage increase as it's implemented for the full 12 months. So that's the difference between the 5.6 and the 3.3.
So just briefly back on the increase. So in fiscal year 2013, it appears that we averaged about 60 million per quarter on the average.
Yes.
And so now we're projecting somewhere around 64 million on the
Yes.
average for the year.
Yes.
So it's about $16 million increase total for the year. So about we're forecasting about 4 million on the average because since it's kept level in 2014.
Right.
On the average, we're seeing about 4 million per quarter increase or $16 million increase over the course of the year.
Correct.
Okay.
There's some change. This is just payroll tax, so there's some
Correct.
change in self-employment, and the state in lieu is not reflected in these numbers as well. But you're correct in the payroll tax. All right. We're assuming no impact, or full funding of federal grants through MAP 21, no impact there. I'll jump to the changes because I think that's where it'd be important for you to understand the changes that we're proposing from the version that was approved and reviewed by the Tax Supervising and Conservation Commission, and now what we're asking you to review and adopt. So the overall payroll tax adjustment, including self-employment and state in lieu, goes down about $6 million. We've added the $500,000 of expanded service to Washington County. We've also added an element that we had missed from impacts of the Affordable Care Act on existing employers that offer medical insurance. There's some excise tax that we're subject to, and some additional fees as well. So this is about $800,000 that's being added into the budget that we have not understood fully the impact of the Affordable Care Act. The next couple items are really just have zero impact on the budget. They're either fully funded or it's just a timing, moving some money between projects from FY13 to FY14. Just jumping to the next page, I just wanted to hit that we are, part of the way we're offsetting some of these increases is we have decreased our assumed cost for diesel fuel. We're moving it from $3.45 a gallon to $3.35, which reduces our that saves us about $600,000 a year. So the big impact then is with fund balance, and we are not proposing any other significant changes on the expense side for the capital expenditures. So we believe there's enough resources within fund balance at this point to offset the reduction in the payroll tax assumption. So with these changes, the reduction in fund balance, we still retain 2.5 months of fund balance. The one thing I would point out with these numbers is that if you look at total operating revenues minus total operating expenses, we still have a $21 million positive result. But there's a significant increase this year in capital spending, about $34 million. And so we have, in our forecast, we've assumed another large expenditure for capital next year in this same range. But then in subsequent years, as we had a lot of catch-up to do on the capital side with bus procurement and other capital needs. But in out years, that number is reduced to $20 million. So I think if you think about sort of our long-term balance of continuing revenues and continuing expenses, we are really keeping those in pretty good balance. And this extra money that now is coming out of fund balance is really, I think the way to think about it is additional money being allocated to capital. We're still retaining our 2.5 months of fund balance.
For the 22nd, if you could bring us a revised financial forecast that reflects these changes.
Sure.
I think rather than talking about verbally, it would be helpful at least for me to see it
Yeah.
graphically. So
Very
they're
good.
going to do that, I appreciate it.
Mr. President, before we move from that, if I might ask Dave a question, you reduced the cost per gallon of diesel fuel. At some point back, in the expenditures of diesel fuel predating your return, the funds that were not used in a current month for fuel because of the fuel fluctuating prices was then set aside back into a fuel type of set aside, whatever it was called at that point. What's happening to that now, and how will that impact what we're doing? The projecting is to be flat through 2015. That's a long period of time for a flat projection. My gas price goes up and down each week, and I have to pick the days in which I buy fuel and make sure. I mean, some days it's yellow light is just saying if you don't hurry up, I'm going to go out too. But what's the impact of this reduction just based solely on a flat projection?
Our actual experience is running under this as well. At this point, we're averaging, so we still have some cushion in the revised number. It's obviously a smaller cushion, but we're averaging about $3.20 a gallon right now. So we have a little flexibility still in this number. As far as the reserve and the savings, budgetary savings, those at this point have just all been rolled into the fund balance and are not separately set aside anywhere, but they are part of our unallocated fund balance. So as we talked about the 2.5 months, it would include the money that was the savings from previous fuel savings.
That gives me a little bit of comfort. I'll tell you the reason why. Because if the fuel price fluctuates, and that has gone into a kind of an unrestricted type fund balance, which then leaves it open that it can be spent for some other things because there's no restrictions. If diesel prices happen to jump we could be in the catch-all of that program back at that point was to make sure that if you had $2 million worth of fuel allocated for this month, you only needed 1.5, you could wrap that other 5 into a program that would just be for fuel so that no matter what happened in the course of that year, you had enough funds to take care of whatever the fuel costs would be. I have a bit of a comfort that that has been removed, just it seems just based on a flat projection. I think we may find ourselves at the end of budget year at a point that we need those funds, and those funds may have been allocated for something else, and that wasn't present in our minds. So I think I would like to ask for something of that to be left in that cushion and specified as it was before to being a fuel type of thing only. And probably at the course of the end of the fiscal year, that might be something that then could be considered to be used if it's had not been used, but that level of comfort is going to be left for me in terms of the fuel pricing.
I just might also note that I think one of the ways we deal with that is contingency. That would, a spike in diesel price would be one of the reasons you have the contingency fund. So maybe what we can do is report to you on what we have in terms of what that over or under is accumulated to over a period of time, and so make sure that that's available in the contingency line, that if the board needed to tap it in the next year for unexpected reasons, that it would be available. So perhaps if that sounds, then we report back to you then on the 22nd on that. That sounds acceptable.
Okay, yeah, we can hear that and give it more consideration there.
Okay.
Thank you.
I would just like to make one other point related to this resolution that we haven't discussed before, but, and this is the note that's at the end of here, we are changing our basis. This resolution changes our basis of accounting from accrual to cash for a couple of key elements. And again, this is just for budget or reporting. We still will report on an accrual basis for generally accepted accounting principles, financials. But this has to do with the change in the pension, GASB 68, which is going to change the way, starting July 1, we account for pensions. We will have to put full liability, unfunded liability on our books, which we haven't before. And then the expense will be based on a GAAP basis, will be based on the change in the liability. So if we have bad, and there's no smoothing a lot, so if you had bad returns in 1 year, you're going to have a big expense. So if we were to put, from a GAAP basis, we're not able to predict that ahead, and so that's why we want to shift this to a cash basis, because again, we don't have to necessarily fund that expense, but I guess I'll stop.
Well, and I think it's worth noting, again, this is a change in response to Governmental Accounting Standards Board directive, and that this directive applies to all jurisdictions in the country, not just Canada. So all jurisdictions are going to be doing something similar and will be seeing similar information.
Budget law, Oregon budget law requires the board to make any changes in accounting methods. So that's why this has been added to this resolution.
Yes. So, Director Prosser, when you said the Government Accounting Standards Board is making this change and adjustment, are they making the change in the requirement of accounting for the unfunded liability, or are they specifically saying we go to a cash basis? And this cash basis that we're talking about is just for budgeting?
And I really turn to Dave, but my understanding is that it's accounting for unfunded liability.
They're requiring us to put the unfunded liability on our books as a liability, which under previous GASB rules, as long as you were funding your annual required contribution, you did not have a liability. So it's a major change in the way pensions are going to be displayed on our financials on our balance sheet. But then we report under two bases of accounting: full GAAP, and that's what Moss Adams audits. But then there's a budget basis financial reporting, and that's what this resolution is adopting, that budget basis financial reporting. And that's where, and then Moss Adams audits those books as well. And there's a schedule that's a reconciliation between those two books, and they audit that reconciliation. But this is where we're getting these differences, and we need the board to allow us to account for these differently.
So who actually gets the different financials? Who actually gets the Moss Adams kind of the gap and then the budget basis?
Well, the rating agencies, people who buy our bonds are primarily looking at our GAAP financials. The budget basis is it's for the most part what you're seeing on a monthly basis, and it's what's generally reviewed by the public.
And so as we move to a cash, as in this resolution on the budget basis, what we see is basically our cash position rather than the full picture of what our GAAP liabilities. I mean, because that's in a sense that's where our major differences are going to be. I mean, there are going to be other differences, but primarily the major differences is going to be this pretty significant unfunded liability that can, as you said, there's no smoothing allowed, so it can vary greatly.
Yes.
But then the cash basis that we'll be seeing, and the budget basis from a cash accounting perspective, is I'm going to say it's probably a little more realistic in real time in regards to how our operations are being directed. Is that a correct statement?
That's very fair.
Okay, excellent.
So any questions about sort of where we stand with the budget? What I was going to do is go through, for lack of a better description, the work program ahead, if that's acceptable, Mr. Board President.
It is, and so what I'm hearing is you'll bring back the accounting of this, or the spreadsheet that shows these changes.
Yes.
So we can see these all in one place and understand that. Good, yes, you bet, please proceed.
Very good. Well, as you remember, last June, you adopted a resolution that had a number of items that you asked us to work through, and we've reported in past sessions to you about the status of those work program items. What I wanted to do was begin to share what we are hearing from both you and from the public in terms of additional items to focus on and into the budget year itself. And there's a number here, and what I'd like is feedback you have about the completeness of the list or the way it's stated. So first of all, is the whole category of fair policy issues, and there's a number that are listed here. The first one is the Portland Public Schools Student Pass Program. We've shared with you in the past the exchange of letters between Superintendent Smith and me, and obviously involved Mary Hill's office as well. But the notion is that we need to look at that program's sustainability over a long period of time, recognizing the current program that is subsidized by TriMet isn't in a sustainable funding pattern right now. So we need to look at that program, both funding and perhaps even some eligibility issues associated with it. And so the goal for that, by the way, is to complete that program by December 2nd, because that's the deadline for families to make choices about school choice and school location. So the school district wants that security moving into the next year as families make that choice. So that's a work program item. It's one that we need to start on very soon to meet that December deadline. You have noted in your conversations, and we'll have a further conversation on fair policy this morning about honor citizen lit fares, looking at those levels again. I think it's appropriate that just notes that we will be doing that, as well as additional fees, whether 2-hour fees or express surcharges or parking surcharges would be in order. And so that is noted as a work program item. Again, I think our fair policy review that starts this morning will be the lead into that. Finally, the last item noted is related to the recommendation that Opal has brought forward, which is for a 3-hour transfer with unlimited transfers at 7 p.m. One of the things I wanted to note was that we have underway a very thorough analysis of that with brand new data as Opal has requested, so updated origin destination data, updated metro travel data, and other data. And so we expect to have that review completed by the end of June and in Opal's hands by that point in time. And then what we'd like to do is schedule some work sessions with those with advocates to review the work, bring all of that forward to the board, likely in July briefing, and review all that materials. And that would be then for your consideration about whether changes are needed or not. That we will slice and dice this so that you can begin to look at the impact on various times of day or various policies. But I think it's a fair question that Opal's asking, and one that we want to make sure that we have a very thorough review of. And so that would be a key work program item. I'd also note that we also carry forward, as noted here, the $1.3 million for the Access to Transit Fare program, the program that works with particularly is focused on low-income individuals and families through nonprofits. And so that program is continuing again through the year. We'll continue to review that. You'll see an update on that later today as well.
Mr. General Manager, Mr. President, Mr. General Manager, before you leave the 3-hour, I would like to ask, I know this is going to add to what the staff has to do, but what is going to be the implications and the impact on other fare structures if a 3-hour extension is given? For instance, I buy a monthly pass which has built in the boardings and it's a cost to here. If now the daily fare, or whatever fare structure now allows me after 7 p.m. to just get on and off at will until the end of the closing, is that going to now reduce my cost of a monthly pass or a weekly pass or whatever? Or now is it going to be one that turns it a different way? This is getting that, and this has still got a higher cost to it. And I think both of those pieces need to be looked at in order to come to an informed decision about if the 3-hour transfer works, if 7 p.m. to closing really works. I would be one would be saying, you got to give me something back. If I'm paying for the whole month, or a whole 30-day or whatever, and there is no adjustments to that. And I think that that might be a backwards move, but I would like to have some type of data around that to help with an more informed decision.
It's an excellent question. So fundamentally, how does it affect all the other fare categories that we have? And as you see, there's a lot of them as we go through that briefing later today. But I think excellent question. And we'll definitely dig into that.
I have, not so much on this one, but just around the PPS Student Pass program. Is that a committee that will be looking at that?
We'll be putting together a working group, and we haven't really formed it yet. Olivia, any status right now?
No, I think the other two governments are still going through their budget process, although for theirs and I think we're still waiting for the schools. But as soon as that's over.
I know the superintendent has run into her. She's very anxious to get going on it, so I think maybe what we want to do is sort of make sure you're comfort that this is where I see, and then what we would do is begin to advance with the other partners.
So, and a follow-up question. So, I know we had talked about the regional equity around that. So, will that be part of this
Yes.
discussion as well? It's the
Yes.
whole package rather than just
Right.
PPS.
Those are good comments, and what we need to do is augment our staff report here recognize those clarifications to bring up, so we appreciate this very much. The other piece of additional work, we have a piece of work associated with pension funding. I think Dave generally addressed this, but there are new accounting standards coming into play related to how we treat pension funding. So we need to have a plan for how to move our pension to fully funded over a period of time. And so that's something that we'll be bringing back to the board as well in the next few months. With other post-employment benefits, the board's focus on that continues, our focus on that continues. Our view is fundamentally that is first and foremost a benefit issue. We really have to get our benefits to be at a reasonable level, and then we can begin to fund it. These are now funded as a pay-as-you-go basis, and I don't see a fundamental shift in that in the near term. But the affordability of that really depends on what the benefit level is, and that's the focus on that. And again, that's one of the key items in the ongoing conversations with the union on the expired contract. Questions about that? Because Dave could actually augment what's intended with that plan.
Well,
We're asking, looking at the board, you need more on this. I don't think we need any more on that, thank you.
Let me grab a drink of water, so
Oh, that's what you
That was the real
wanted.
Finally, non-union compensation. What we wanted to do, just be very clear about this, that.
Thank you.
What we have recognized is that we have different tiers of employees, and our objective related to non-union compensation is that total compensation be in line with the marketplace, so that we can attract and retain very talented employees, which thank heavens we have right now. So what we want to do is really do a much more in-depth look at this over the next few months and come back to the board probably in the fall for a review of that, and again, a public discussion and action associated with non-union salaries, whether or not there's any adjustment due or what it might be and how it might be administered. That would mean that there'd be no increase until, or no earlier than January 1st, and that would obviously be dependent on the board's action. And at that point in time, I'd also be clear that we are following normal budget practice with this, which is if there is an increase, it would be subject to action of the board to transfer the funds for contingency at that point in time. But again, no definition of what that is right now because we need time to study this, come back to the board with a recommendation, and at that point in time, the board will be asked to consider that, whatever that recommendation might be, whether that's 0 or something other.
Good for that discussion. And it's clear there is some differences in the non-union, I guess, staffing and compensation plans that needs to be acknowledged and recognized, so that we're not putting one group of non-union employees at odds with another. So I think it's a very valuable discussion that we have. Other comments, questions on that? Any other questions? I did have one question I just thought about. You have to answer it now because it isn't on this list, but in light of the press about the ticket vending machines,
Yes.
maybe we ought to, on the 22nd, just outline the budget that we have for replacement of those, and also kind of update the board on the timing so we know what that is. I think the plan was you're going to have major portions of it done here in the next few months, and I think we need, and the board has recognized this.